welcome back to another one of our online lectures here in world history. We're going to really finish off our unit on Rome today by looking at a part of the Roman Empire called Byzantium. Oftentimes it gets called the New Rome, and we're going to take a look at why that is. I mean, ultimately it really was just a part of the Roman Empire. But in the last lecture, we saw Rome fell in 476 AD for a multitude of reasons, social, political, economic, and military, as well as Germanic invasions. But it was the eastern half of the empire that hangs on, and the eastern half of the empire gets known as Byzantium, and we want to take a look at it today and kind of understand what it's all about. So let's get into it. We only have one constructive response question today. The question says, describe the key elements of Byzantium that led it to be called the New Rome. So we're certainly going to make that connection. We will see how it, though it's got a different name and it doesn't include the city of Rome, it's still Roman in nature and in culture. What will we learn? Well, we're going to answer the question, what was Byzantium? So we're certainly going to dive into that. We're going to talk a lot about Emperor Justinian. We've watched the Byzantines engineering an empire, so we know a little bit about him coming into this, and we'll definitely expand on that. And then we're going to finish with looking at a split in Christianity that occurs that gives us the Eastern Orthodox Church, or the Eastern Orthodox branch of Christianity. So that's our plan here today. That's what we're going to look at. Let's dive into it. So Byzantium, the New Rome, setting the stage. We know that due to Germanic invasions, the Western Roman Empire had collapsed. We had talked a lot about that in the previous lecture, and I had mentioned that earlier here right now. So for nearly 1,000 years after the collapse of the Western Empire, Byzantium in the east would continue to thrive and build upon its Roman foundations. So it's going to hang on quite a bit longer than its Western counterpart. So here's a map, show you where Byzantium is. Byzantium gets its name from the city of Byzantium that was located right here. So everything you see here in pink is known as the Byzantine Empire, or known as Byzantium. It's once part of the Roman Empire, and it still is Roman, although it's going to take a slightly different identity over the years. So this is the region we are talking about here. So why was Byzantium called the New Rome? Well, I mentioned to you, it was Roman. It just really was part of the empire. So it's very easy to get that name. So Byzantium had Roman emperors, it had Roman architecture, Roman culture, and certainly it had Christianity, which had developed under the Romans. So it was Roman. Byzantine emperors ruled with absolute power, just like Roman emperors. So very similar power structure here. They were also head of the church. And that makes sense because we had talked about in our Christianity section how both Constantine and Emperor Theodosius had promoted Christianity. Theodosius himself made Christianity the official religion of the empire. Basically, you had to be a Christian. So there's no denying the fact that the emperors would have been head of the church, head of the Christian church. There were differences, though. We say this is all Roman. It's not exactly the same type of Roman. For example, in the West, they primarily spoke Latin. Here in the East, they primarily spoke Greek. So there were differences such as they spoke Greek in this region instead of Latin. Now, why was Byzantium wealthier? Well, it's its wealth that allows Byzantium to hang on. Without this wealth, it probably would have succumbed to the same reasons the Western Empire fell. But the biggest part of all this is its location. Location always matters. That's why we spend time looking at geography in each of these civilizations, because without it, without good geography, most civilizations don't last. So Byzantium was located in the middle of several trade routes that allowed it to prosper. So people kept coming to Constantinople, coming to these major cities because they could trade there and they could make money. And of course, that's going to continue to keep people living. There's going to be plenty of poor people there in this section, but there's going to allow people to continue to live and live somewhat comfortably in this region of the Roman Empire. The other thing is, because of location, they weren't as prone to Germanic attacks like the Western Empire. The Huns had attacked Byzantium, but the Germanic tribes, those Vandals, Visigoths, Saxons, Lombards, and Franks, that had been pushed into Roman lands were not in this region, so they weren't pushed into the Eastern Empire. So therefore, you didn't have that constant threat of invasion. So there's no doubt that's going to allow Byzantium to keep its wealth and keep its prosperity. We don't have to worry about these Germanic people moving into your land and taking your property. So, one of the most recognizable and well-known emperors of the New Rome, of the Byzantines, was Justinian, who you see here in the upper right. Justinian takes control of Byzantium in 527 AD. And probably his most recognizable accomplishment is his Justinian Code. So he set up the Justinian Code, which was a uniform set of laws created from outdated Roman laws. Because at this point in 527, the Roman Empire dates back to the about 100 or earlier BC. So you're talking 600 years of laws have been written. And so what he did is he wanted to go through those laws and see which ones still were useful for his empire. And many of them were, very Roman in nature. So it still has that identity of what Rome was within their law structure. So it contained 5,000 Roman laws, still considered useful. And it was broken up into 4 works. There was the Code, the Digest, the Institutes, and the Novella. One of the other things that Justinian does is he's definitely a Christian empire. Christian emperor, sorry, and he really wants a Christian empire, and he built many churches to prove that, and he probably built one of the most spectacular churches that still exists today. It's called the Hagia Sophia. It's the pronunciation for this one here. It's hailed as the most splendid church in the Christian world. It has been since turned into a Muslim mosque because this part of the world will be taken over by the Ottoman Turks, a Muslim group, a little bit later on in history. But it still stands today, and I'll show you some images of this on the next couple of slides. But he definitely wanted to prove that he was a strong Christian emperor, and this church is definitely a statement of that. Now, the Eastern Empire here was still prone to some small attacks. Plague hit this area. So plagues and attacks caused the Byzantine Empire to fall after the death of Justinian. And some people disagree on when this exactly happened. Some people say the empire didn't fall until those Ottoman Turks took over. But regardless, it did have sort of its bumps in the road a little bit after Justinian's death. Here's the Hagia Sophia. You can see it's a very beautiful church. These spires here on each corner would have been built later. Those are a little bit more Muslim in nature. As you can see inside, absolutely a beautiful church. Remarkable dome that would have been very difficult to build in its time. And you can see on the walls, you've got definitely some Islamic symbols there, proving that it has been turned into a different type of church. But regardless, it was built for Christianity under Emperor Justinian. So, we know this is a Christian empire. Christianity had spread since the height of the Roman Empire. But we have to understand Christianity in its form here today in the modern world is actually different than how it was back during this time. And I say that because several branches of Christianity have been created since the time of the Romans. So we know, if we want to make sure that we're connecting this to the Romans, that Emperor Constantine had saved Christianity by issuing the Edict of Milan, also known as the Edict of Toleration, that had made Christianity legal. But what ends up happening here is we see one of the first divisions of the church here in 1054. And this takes place over here in the Byzantine Empire. The church divides, so what we end up getting is Roman Catholic or Roman Catholicism in the West. And so in the western half of the empire, they were Catholics. Now, they wouldn't have called themselves Catholics, they would have just called themselves Christians. And some identifying features about Roman Catholics is their services were primarily conducted in Latin, and that was true up really until even the 20th century. The Pope has authority in the Roman Catholic Church over all other bishops, and priests cannot marry. Now I'm going to use those three ideas to compare to the new form of Christianity that develops over here in the Byzantine Empire. So understand, Roman Catholics, up until this point, everybody was a Roman Catholic. You called themselves a Christian, but you were technically a Roman Catholic. But when the church divides in 1054, we get the Eastern Orthodox branch of the Christian church. And this still exists today. It's still Christianity, but in a slightly different form. For example, their services, instead of being conducted in Latin, are conducted in Greek or maybe some of their local languages. Instead of following the Pope, they follow a leader known as the Patriarch. The Patriarch sometimes co-leads with another bishop as head of the church as a group. And the last one is priests may be married in the Eastern Orthodox Church. So those are just three differences. They're both Christian, but we get a little bit of a split here. And you can see the Onion Dome churches here. This is very significant. If you see these, you typically see an Eastern Orthodox church. We don't have many of these around in our part of the world today, but they do exist. There are churches like this here in Minnesota, just not very many. So you have to understand, as Christianity grows and develops, it does change forms. The last form that exists is Protestantism, and we're going to study that very heavily when we get to our Reformation unit in the spring. So basically at this point in time, if you're a Christian, you're either Roman Catholic or you're part of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And we want to make sure we make that connection here because that does come out of the Eastern branch here of the Roman Empire. So that brings us to the end here. The Roman Empire dwindled into oblivion, especially in the West, allowing the Middle Ages to begin. If you've heard of the Middle Ages period, it exists 100% because Rome fell. And we're going to look at that very heavily in second semester. However, in the East, Byzantium held on for a few more centuries, which resulted in a split in Christianity and would eventually set up a bigger conflict, Christianity versus Islam. And that's going to take place in the Middle Ages in a time period called the Crusades. So notice there's lots of different layers of history that get piled on here. So when we get into our second semester studies, specifically the Middle Ages, we'll look at how Christianity and Islam basically go to war against each other in something called the Crusades. So that should wrap up our unit on Rome here. We've talked about how the Western Empire fell. We've looked at specifically the Eastern Empire called Byzantium. We looked at what it was and what happened to it. And how Christianity factored into that. All right, let's finish up our unit on Rome here by finishing up with our constructive response question on Byzantium. The question says, describe the key elements of Byzantium that led it to be called the New Rome. Well, you have to understand it was Roman. It was once part of the Roman Empire. Yes, the West has fallen, but the eastern half of the empire hung on. So that's our first part. It was Roman. It was always a part of the Roman Empire. It used Roman architecture. It used Roman law. They even had Roman emperors. There was Latin that was spoken there, although Greek was one of the heavy languages that was spoken in this region as well. Emperor Justinian considered himself a Roman emperor. They had Christianity, which developed and was made the official religion of the Romans. So we have lots of different examples that we can use that definitely point us that Byzantium was Roman in nature and therefore got the name the New Rome. So that's going to do it for us here today. Go ahead and rate yourself on a 4, 3, 2, 1 scale. 4 being, I think I can answer this question properly. 3 being, I'm close. 2 being, I've got some work to do. And 1 being, I really don't know what this question is saying. It's always good to self-assess yourself, so please go ahead and do so. That's going to do it for us here. Hope you learned something. We'll see you next time.